Good day. At the end of my video yesterday, I said that I would be discussing in today's video the situation in the Middle East, and that remains fully my intention. But before doing so, I must return again to the situation in Ukraine, because the military situation continues to deteriorate in terms of Ukrainian defenses, that is, and in fact, the news, in some respects, continues to be dramatic. The first thing to say is that over the course of the last 12 hours, the Russians began what looks like another big missile strike on Ukraine. I say began because as I am making this program, there are reports of more Russian bombers taking to the sky. Tupolev 22 M3s to be precise, the launch vehicle for the colossal KH-22-32 missiles, anti-ship missiles, which have a devastating impact, fly at supersonic speeds, and which Ukraine has up to now admitted that it has never been able to shoot down. Anyway, these Tupolev 22 M3s are now in the sky, or at least that's what the reports say. So it looks as if the missile strike is still underway. Now, as always happens, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided a very terse statement indeed about the missile strike and about its purposes. It says the following: in the morning, the Russian armed forces delivered a group strike by high-precision, long-range air and ground-based weapons at Ukrainian military-industrial complex facilities producing missiles and their parts, ammunition and explosives. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All the assigned targets have been engaged. And in fact, we've been getting lots of pictures of explosions, of damaged buildings, of that kind of thing. From what one can tell, the main focus of the strike was three cities: Kiev, Ukraine's capital; Kharkiv, its biggest industrial center and the second biggest city in Ukraine; and Pavlograd. Now, the last is interesting because if it is the Pavlograd that I know, then this is a small town, a small city, east of the Dnieper, located west of Donbass. It is, in fact, the main urban center between Donbass and the Dnieper. And one might think there's at least a possibility that the Russians might eventually, if they do decide to move towards the Dnieper, well, they might and conduct an enveloping action of Ukrainian forces in Donbass, that they might ultimately have some objective in attacking or capturing Pavlograd. I remember that Alex Vershinin, from whom I must say we haven't been hearing for a long time now, but Alex Vershinin, who writes for the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, though he is a retired American officer, way back, I think in the autumn of 2022, suggested an elaborate battle plan that the Russians might eventually follow, whereby there would be a northward advance from Zaporozhye region towards Pavlograd, combined with a strike from the north, from Kharkiv region, the two parts of the pincer meeting in Pavlograd, and in effect encircling Ukrainian troops in Donbass. Well, that hasn't happened. I'm not suggesting that this missile strike on Pavlograd is connected to that in any way. Probably, almost certainly it's not. But anyway, the attack on Pavlograd, about which we have no information, is interesting and suggestive. I would add that at an earlier stage in the war, I think actually back in 2022, or it might have been in early 2023, there was another big Russian missile strike on Pavlograd. An enormous explosion took place there. It was assumed that this was an ammunition dump or warehouse where the Ukrainians were storing ammunition, presumably for use by their troops in Donbass, and perhaps that's what we're seeing again. Anyway, we will find out, no doubt, in due course, once more information about, as I said, what at the moment appears to be an ongoing strike, an ongoing missile strike, as more information trickles in. Now, the other two targets, main targets, Kiev and Kharkiv, again, it's what one would expect. These are Ukraine's two major remaining military industrial cities, Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, as the Russians still call it, also major industrial centers, but perhaps rather too close to the front lines to be safe to use in terms of military industrial production. But anyway, Kiev and Kharkiv, there are large numbers of factories, industrial factories, located in both of these cities. And of course, Kharkiv, in a sense, is a frontline city. It was a frontline city earlier in the war for much of 2022, until the Russians took a decision to withdraw completely from Kharkiv region. They seem to be back there again. But anyway, there are reports, there have been lots of rumors that the Russians are planning some kind of major advance into Kharkiv region from the north, perhaps sometime in the later this winter, or perhaps more plausibly in the summer after the spring Rasputitsa. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. But certainly Kharkiv has come in for a very heavy battering over the last couple of weeks, and that continues. And Kiev, major industrial center as well, lots of industrial plants located there. But it's also, of course, the epicenter of Ukraine's air defense system. This is where most, perhaps all, of the Patriot missile batteries are located. And again, the information that one is getting suggests that this air defense system is not working very well in Kiev, even as the Russians clearly are working to deplete it and to reduce it by hunting launchers and destroying launchers, but also forcing the Ukrainians to expend expensive Patriot missiles interceptors, which are relatively few in number, trying to shoot down these Russian missiles. Now, there is one interesting fact about this Russian report from the Defense Ministry. It says that it was a group strike by high-precision, long-range air and ground-based weapons. And notice that there is no reference here to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles being used. And I get the impression that the Russians did launch some Iskander-M ballistic missiles, or at least ballistic missiles, some of them perhaps obtained from North Korea at ground targets. But the bulk of this particular attack was carried out using the subsonic KH-101 air-breathing cruise turbojet-powered cruise missiles launched from the Tupolev 95 bombers, which, of course, are the primary launch vehicle for these particular cruise missiles. Now, that's all the information the Russians have given. the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has given its own information, and briefly, this is what it has said, at least this is what it is reporting on its Telegram channel. The enemy launched a combined missile attack on Ukraine using cruise, ballistic, air, and anti-aircraft guided weapons, missiles. Now, as I said, the anti-aircraft guided missiles I have discussed many times. This implies that the Russians have converted S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles and are using them against ground targets in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have been routinely reporting this. The same story routinely appears in the Western media. I have expressed my own strong doubts about this. A source who is someone who has a great deal more knowledge of this kind of thing than I do, has also straightforwardly challenged this idea that anti-aircraft guided missiles, S-300s and S-400s, are being used in this way. I've had yet another source who has access to information in Russia, who straightforwardly has denied it. But the Ukrainians persist in this, and I said that I suspect the origin of this story is that from time to time, Ukrainian air defense missiles, historically S-300 missiles, have fallen on residential buildings in Ukraine when they have failed to intercept Russian missiles, and the Ukrainians have sought to pass these missiles off as Russian. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time discussing that. I'm deeply skeptical about this claim. Anyway, the Ukrainian report from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry then goes on to say this: as a result of combat operations, the Air Force, in cooperation with the Air Defense Forces, destroyed 15 KH-101, KH-555 and KH-55 cruise missiles, 5 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and 1 KH-59 guided missile. Now, notice a few things. Up to now, until very recently, the Ukrainians have been admitting that they cannot shoot down Russian ballistic missiles. Suddenly, they're claiming that they've shot down 5 Iskander-M ballistic missiles. I'm going to say straight away that I don't place any credence in that claim. I think it is extremely unlikely to be true, but that's what the Ukrainians are saying. Now, they're also claiming to have shot down 15 KH-101, KH-555 and KH-55 cruise missiles. Now, again, this is, I suspect, somewhat misleading, because the KH-55 and KH-555 cruise missiles that the Russians launch appear to be old Soviet-era missiles that the Russians launch against Ukraine alongside KH-101s to act as decoys. So what Ukraine is saying is that they shot down 15 missiles, of which, however, some were decoys. Now, there is, in fact, film, and I should say that there are legal penalties for Ukrainians who actually provide film of Russian missile attacks. So whoever is making these films is taking risks. But anyway, there is film of a KH-101 missile flying over Kiev, engaging in all kinds of complex maneuvers as it does so, firing off various Smaller decoys, I am not able to understand this film very well myself. But anyway, the point is, it's flying over Kiev, and it looks as if Ukrainian air defenses are doing nothing to intercept it. So some missiles are able to get through. The attack appears to have happened early in the morning. In other words, the missiles arrived in Kiev in the daylight hours, as the light was already available. And we see that these missiles are indeed getting through. And one gets the sense again that Ukrainian air defenses in Kiev, the air defense system built around the Patriot missile system, is not working very well. So that's all I can say about this particular report from the Ukrainians in terms of the long-range missiles. Now, they also claim that they shot down one Kh-59 guided missile. This is a tactical missile launched by presumably Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, or perhaps Sukhoi 35 fighter bombers. Again, it's the kind of missile, apparently it's a big and rather powerful missile. It's the kind of missile that the Russians might be expected to use in order to support strikes on air defense positions, bunkers, and that kind of thing. Now, note that the Ukrainians are claiming this time that they've shot down 21 out of the 41 missiles that they say the Russians launched. I've already said that there are problems with this Ukrainian report. The 21 missiles that they say they shot down include 5 Iskander-M missiles, which they have previously said they cannot shoot down. There's no explanation about how they did it on this occasion. And I wonder whether that is an invented claim. And I've also pointed out that amongst the 15 jet-powered cruise missiles that they say they shot down, some of them clearly were decoys. So there we go. It seems once again that the Ukrainian air defense system has been suffering problems and has not been able to intercept. They claim to have intercepted roughly half the missiles that the Russians launched. This is compared with the 90% plus of Russian missiles that they used to routinely claim last winter that they were shooting down. Well, now they're only claiming to have shot down around half, and even their own report, to my mind, casts doubt on the plausibility of this. Now, there are more attacks probably coming. We'll see what happens. It's interesting that the Russians now feel able to launch missile strikes during the day. And again, one wonders why the Russians are doing that. Probably there were drone strikes as well. There are more and more reports, by the way, that the jet-powered uranium-2 drone is now on its way. Apparently it's been actually quite heavily modified by the Russians. It's now apparently some kind of flying wing design, which would suggest a further attempt to develop stealth capabilities for this particular drone. From what I understand, it is shorter ranged than the classical uranium-2 drone with its turboprop engine. But, we'll just have to wait and see. But probably uranium-2s also participated in this attack, though interestingly, the Ukrainians tell us nothing about them. And anyway, we will see. Now, I'm going to just go back to the Russian report briefly. Again, the Russians said that they used ground-based weapons. They don't say ground-based ballistic missiles. And the Russians have recently used ground-based cruise missiles against Ukrainian positions on the Black Sea. Now, these were P-35 cruise missiles. These are huge cruise missiles developed by the Soviet Union in the early 1960s. Apparently, they still use the old Soviet guidance systems from that era, and they were launched at these Ukrainian positions near Odessa from Crimea. And these are big missiles, apparently, despite the fact that they use what are by now rather dated guidance systems, well, certainly dated guidance systems, dating from the 1960s. These big cruise missiles, nonetheless, apparently did get through, and the Russians claim that they did do a considerable amount of damage. I should say that these are supersonic missiles, and the missiles that were launched apparently launched from missile batteries located in Crimea, developed by the Soviet Union in the 1960s. And some of them are, there's pictures of some of them on operation. See the missile launcher popping out from the ground and firing the missile. It's something that does, I have to say, look a little like something out of a James Bond novel, film. But anyway, there we go. But apparently these missiles were launched in that way, and that was a case of ground-launched cruise missiles being used against ground targets in Odessa. The supersonic, they were able apparently to get through and strike their targets with sufficient accuracy, let's say. Now, I am sure that no such missiles were used in this strike on Kharkiv, Kiev, and Pavlograd. But I would just say that there were reports last year that the Russians were adapting the Kh-35, which is a anti-ship missile, and for which there are ground launchers, that they were adapting it to strike at ground targets. And we didn't hear much more about that. It's a smaller missile. It's subsonic, but it flies close to the ground, and it is quite fast. And the point was that it could be used, it could be launched from ground launchers fairly close to the border, to the contact line, and that would give the Ukrainians less time to react, to respond, because, as I said, these missiles are quite fast, and the Ukrainians are able to get information from their American and British friends about Russian bombers, Tupolev 95s, taking off from their air bases, and so they can, to some extent, prepare for the big Russian missile strikes. But this would not be possible in terms of, or at least not to anything like the same extent, if Kh-35s were being used from ground launchers. And I found it a little surprising that this didn't seem to have happened, that the Russians didn't, in the end, appear to have used their Kh-35 missiles in that way. Well, who knows? Perhaps they are planning to. Perhaps they already have. Note again, they say ground-based weapons. They don't say ground-based ballistic missiles. as they have done in the past. So anyway, I will leave it at that. We will get much more information over the next day or so about this missile strike. When that information comes, I will say a great deal more about it. Now, we're still getting lots of news from the battlefronts, and it looks like yesterday was a very bad day for Ukraine. I'm going to come back to that shortly. But the main focus continues to be the fighting in Avdeyevka. And one of the things that happened yesterday was that one of the other major fortified positions that the Ukrainians hold or used to hold in the southern part of Avdeyevka, actually beyond Avdeyevka itself, an air defense base. Resistance there appears to have collapsed. There is another fortified position just to the north of that air base, a place called Cheburasha by the Russians. I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, apparently Ukrainian troops are still clinging on there, but it's widely assumed that they will withdraw because they're in the process of encirclement. And anyway, it's now confirmed that the Russians have established control of a significant belt of southern Avdeyevka, that they've captured this air defense base, and they're continuing to strengthen their positions in southern Avdeyevka, even as they push towards other parts of Avdeyevka from other directions, including from a village called Kamenka, which is located to the north of Avdeyevka and which the Russians have for some time held. Now, over the course of the last couple of hours, there's been a rather intriguing story. I've seen it in various places. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has an interesting account of it, that when the Russians captured the industrial area of Avdeyevka some weeks ago, they apparently came across a tunnel or a pipe which the Ukrainians had never detected, and they were able to send troops, supposedly 150 troops, down this tunnel, and the troops at the other end of the tunnel suddenly popped out in some roads, certain roads, far behind Ukrainian lines. This allegedly completely disorganized the Ukrainian defenses in southern Avdeyevka. That enabled the Russians to launch further assaults on Ukrainian fortified positions south of Avdeyevka. The Ukrainians tried to counterattack. And in fact, we have had many reports that there was an attempted Ukrainian counterattack over the last 2 or 3 days against trying to push back these Russian forces that were advancing. According to Riba, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles participated in this counterattack. The counterattack, however, failed. The Russians were able to hold their positions and indeed consolidate. And it was this clever ruse of using this tunnel, I'm going to call it a tunnel, which explains the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in southern Avdeyevka. Now, I am going to express a little skepticism about this story, which appears to have originated from Ukrainian sources. Now, this is a tunnel which we are asked to believe that the Ukrainians, who have been in physical possession of Avdeyevka since, 1991, but in addition, their military has been there since 2014, building up enormous, elaborate fortifications. Anyway, this is a tunnel which supposedly they never detected. They weren't aware of its existence. And they never apparently found it, but the Russians were able to find this tunnel within a few weeks of capturing the industrial area of Avdeyevka, where one of the exit points to this tunnel is located. And there is no explanation that I've seen of what this tunnel is supposed to have been for. I mean, was it some kind of industrial pipe or tunnel? What, I mean, was it to transport materials from the center of Avdeyevka to the industrial area? Was it built as part of some kind of air defense system by the Soviets long ago and got forgotten? Anyway, this doesn't seem to me to make a huge amount of sense, or at least, let's put it like this, maybe this story is true, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. And, well, presumably there is a tunnel, and presumably the Russians did use it to some extent, and perhaps the Russians were tipped off about its existence from people who have lived and worked in Avdeyevka, many of whom probably have transferred to Donetsk city and support Russia. Perhaps some of the people in Avdeyevka itself, who perhaps also support Russia, maybe they tipped off the Russians about the existence of this tunnel. But I still find it very difficult to believe that the Ukrainians, who will have presumably, whilst building these elaborate fortifications in Avdeyevka, have taken the precaution to check and establish every millimeter of ground. I find it difficult to believe that a tunnel complex like this would have gone completely unnoticed in the way that it is supposed to have been the case. Now, I say that, of course, things like this do happen in life and in war. Sometimes things like this get overlooked. Sometimes there's a sheer lack of competence or ability. The officers, apparently, who, the engineering officer or technicians who were building the fortifications didn't do their job properly, didn't survey the ground properly. So, it's not impossible, but it does seem to me a little unlikely. And would a tunnel by itself, which is apparently quite a narrow tunnel, have been sufficient by itself to change the entire situation in southern Avdeyevka so completely? Now, bear in mind that for about a week before we got the news about the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in southern Avdeyevka, there was ample film of Russian aircraft bombing positions in Avdeyevka relentlessly, day after day, often with enormously powerful Fab 500 bombs. I can't help but think that this was clearly a softening up exercise in advance of an assault on southern Avdeyevka, which both the Russians and the Ukrainians could see coming. So I wonder whether this story about the tunnel hasn't been conjured up by some people in Ukraine to try to explain why the entire defense system in southern Avdeyevka suddenly collapsed. And of course, it's an attractive story. As I said, it again has something of a James Bond quality about it. Maybe the Russians, or some people in Russia, notice the defense ministry has said nothing about this in Moscow. The Russian defense ministry has said nothing about this. But it's an attractive story, and one again that people in Russia rather like and have also seized on. Anyway, that's just my own skepticism about this. Maybe I'm being too skeptical. But I wonder whether the reality, and this is a point I've been making in several videos now, is that the situation in the southern outskirts of Avdeyevka has been deteriorating, in fact, gradually but steadily over several weeks, so that when the Russians did launch their attack, one which might have used a tunnel, which perhaps everybody knew about, when that attack was launched, that was why the defenses simply broke down, and that the major reason why the defenses broke down is because the Ukrainian forces in Avdeyevka are, as I said, overstretched and overextended. And I'm going to suggest again that this is perhaps where people are misunderstanding some of the events in another part of Avdeyevka around Stepovoye and Berdichi. Again, I've seen reports saying that there's a huge contrast between the flair and brilliance of the Russian assault in southern Avdeyevka and the supposedly plodding Russian attacks in Stepovoye and Berdichi, where the Russians have failed to achieve a breakthrough. Maybe there has been no breakthrough. Maybe the Russians haven't captured Berdichi because that was not part of the original plan. It's perhaps not so surprising that Berdichi is difficult to capture. Unlike Avdeyevka itself, Berdichi can be easily accessed by Ukraine along multiple supply lines. Ukraine is therefore able to concentrate large numbers of men and machines around Berdichi and Stepovoye and create minefields and do a lot of that sort of thing. In which case, the Russian attacks towards Berdichi might not have been intended so much to capture Berdichi itself, but to prevent the Ukrainians sending all those men and machines who are pinned down defending Berdichi to Avdeyevka itself, where they might have held off the Russians for very much longer. It's very difficult to second guess what the Russian command is doing, or indeed the Ukrainian command is doing. We have very incomplete information about what is going on the battlefronts, and it's not always easy to know exactly what the plans at any one particular point are. I would have thought that whatever Russian officer is in overall charge of the Battle of Avdeyevka is the same officer who is in overall charge of the fighting around Stepovoye and Berdichi, as he is in charge of the fighting in southern Avdeyevka. And it seems to me that this person, whoever he is, presumably knows his job, and that's why he is acting in ways which perhaps we don't fully understand in order to facilitate his objective, which is to capture Avdeyevka, with the main assaults not happening from the area of Stepovoye and Berdichi, but from the south. And on that as a last point, again, I continue to see endless reports and discussions about this incident involving the two Bradleys, and there were in fact two, and the T-90M tank. It gets trotted out repeatedly now in the Western media. A lot of people on the Russian internet stress about it. Again, I think this incident is perhaps being misunderstood. For me, the most important point about that incident is not that a particular tank was knocked out, Apparently, it wasn't fully destroyed, but anyway, there we go. It wasn't that it was knocked out. It is that there was a T-90M tank operating in Stepovoye in the first place. Way back a couple of weeks ago, a journalist at El País, Spanish newspaper, spoke to Ukrainian soldiers defending Stepovoye and Berdichi and the railway line. And these soldiers were saying that if the Russians are able to send heavy armor beyond the railway line, it is curtains. At that point, the entire communications lines to Avdeyevka risk being cut off with disastrous consequences. And defense of Avdeyevka would at that point finally collapse. And here we have proof from the Ukrainians themselves that a Russian tank, heavy armor, in other words, is operating west of the railway line in Stepovoye. Obviously, given the importance to the Ukrainians of preventing the Russians creating an armored fist west of the railway line, the Ukrainians would do everything possible within their power to try to knock out any individual Russian tank that they could, and it's unsurprising that they have managed to do so. But it doesn't change the fact that there are now Russian tanks apparently able to cross the railway line and gradually achieve a build-up there. So, just saying, I think people need to take a step back sometimes, not get too engrossed in the details, try to understand the overall picture, and maybe understand that the way generals, commanders in battle, in what is actually a very complex battle, think might not be easily understandable to us onlookers who are, especially in my case, and I'm, as I've said many times, a civilian, perhaps not the best people to try to second guess what they're thinking and what they do. Anyway, just saying. Now, I said earlier that yesterday appears to have been a very bad day for Ukraine. And this is what I am now going to turn to, because we've had some really astonishing reports from the Russian Defense Ministry about what has been happening in different parts of the battle lines. And let's start with a report that the Russian Defense Ministry published yesterday. And they spoke, first of all, about fighting around Kupiansk and the fact that there was intense fighting going on around Kupiansk. And they said that enemy losses were up to 180 troops, 5 tanks, 2 armored vehicles, and 2 pickup trucks, as well as an M777 artillery system, Star B and D20 howitzers, and 1 M12 anti-tank gun. So an enormous battle apparently going on around Kupiansk. This is the area where, again, the Russians have managed to advance. They've captured a village. They've captured a village. Again, I find it difficult to pronounce the name of this village. And it seems that they are pushing west towards the Oskol River. But look, again, at the losses that the Ukrainians have suffered here. 180 troops, dead and wounded. This is according to the Russians. 5 tanks. And then we go on to read that just a certain distance further south, in the Liman area, where the Russians have also been advancing, 180 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded, 2 tanks and 2 infantry fighting vehicles and 3 motor vehicles were destroyed, as well as a Zuzana self-propelled artillery system made in Slovakia, and 2 US M777 howitzers and 1 D-20 howitzer left over from the Soviet Union. So major battle there. Again, 2 tanks destroyed. So 5 near Kupiansk, 2 in the Liman area, 7 tanks destroyed on what might be called the northern part of the battlefield in a single day. But then it becomes really dramatic, and I've said many times that if you go to the Russian Defense Ministry, its briefings, it's clear that since November of 2022, the single most murderous area of fighting is Bakhmut. And we get reports that tell us this. So in the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainians lost up to 320 troops killed and wounded, 10 tanks, including 1 Leopard 2A5, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 6 armoured vehicles, 1 Strela 10 anti-aircraft missile system, and 12 motor vehicles, and another 2 US-made M777 artillery systems, 1 Polish-made Krab self-propelled artillery system, Star B and D-20 howitzers, 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system, 1 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system, and 2 D-30 guns, all destroyed in this area. And, well, that is 10 tanks destroyed in one day in the Bakhmut area. So 5 tanks destroyed in the Kupiansk area, 2 tanks destroyed in the Liman area, 10 tanks destroyed in the Bakhmut area, 17 tanks in total in Bakhmut and in the north. And just to add, the Russians also claimed that they destroyed yesterday another tank, this time in the Zaporozhye area, that is in the Rabotino, Kamenskoye and Pyatikhatki areas. Or also very heavy losses in artillery. So the French lost another, the Ukrainians lost another of these rather sad Caesar self-propelled artillery systems. It was apparently destroyed in the Zaporozhye region, and another M777 howitzer was destroyed, according to the Russians, in Kherson region, and the Ukrainians lost 100 men, not 300, 100 men in the Kherson region. Apparently some of them, presumably most of them, on the West Bank. So 18 Ukrainian tanks lost over the course of a single day. And according to my very crude arithmetic, I'm not good at numbers. I calculate that, according to the Russians, Ukraine lost over 1,000 men killed and wounded over the course of a single day of fighting yesterday. 18 tanks. Now that is similar to the number of tanks that Ukraine would lose on particularly intense days of fighting during the summer offensive. Except, of course, Ukraine is not engaged in an offensive. It is defending. And what appears to be happening is that the Ukrainians are being forced to pull tanks out of their reserves to try to plug gaps, and these tanks are then being detected by the Russians and are being destroyed. And as I said, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians lost 18 tanks in one day yesterday, even though the Ukrainians supposedly are on the defensive. And they lost, well, I think it was 4 M777 howitzers, M777 howitzers, and or was it 5 M777 howitzers, all in a single day, as well as a Caesar howitzer as well. And it then gets even worse, because the Ukrainians also appear to have made a major attempt to launch a missile strike. And we read that air defense systems, these are Russian air defense systems, again I'm taking this from the Russian Ministry of Defense briefing, shot down a Sukhoi 25 aircraft of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kharkiv region, 6 Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles, as well as 5 HIMARS multiple launch rocket system projectiles. So Ukraine lost 6 Storm Shadows as well. A very heavy day of losses. Now, these figures obviously come from the Russians, but for the record, I think the Russians, they get their figures right in terms of Storm Shadows that are shot down. I think they get their figures right in terms of aircraft that get shot down. And I think that they are roughly right in terms of equipment losses, and almost certainly right in terms of tank losses. I've spoken about aggressive attrition. Well, yesterday we saw an extreme example of this. But note something very remarkable about this Russian Defense Ministry briefing. It discusses the fighting that is taking place on various battlefronts. It talks about fighting, for example, on every battlefront, including the Vremevki ledge, salient, the Vremevka salient area, Novomikhailovka, that is to say the Marinka area. It talks about Ukrainian losses in these areas. It talks about fighting, as I've said, in Bakhmut. It talks about fighting in Kherson region. It talks about fighting in Kupiansk and in the Liman region. There's one part of the battlefronts that the Russian Defense Ministry is saying absolutely nothing about. They're not even giving estimates of Ukrainian losses or telling us how much equipment Ukrainian lost. And that is, of course, Avdeyevka. If you go to the Russian Defense Ministry briefing, they jump directly from discussing the fighting in Bakhmut to discussing the fighting in the Vremevka salient and in the Marinka area. They don't discuss the fighting in Avdeyevka. So I said that if one adds up all the numbers from the Russian Defense Ministry briefing, the Russians are claiming that over 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded yesterday, but the Russians probably know that the actual toll was higher because they don't seem to be taking into account in this briefing the fighting in Avdeyevka, where we know the fighting was most intense and where the most dramatic events were happening. And if you go today to the report, the briefing from the Russian Defense Ministry, well, the first thing you notice is that the losses that Ukraine has suffered up to this point in the day appear to have been rather less than yesterday. That's the first thing to say. But again, the heaviest losses appear to have been in the Bakhmut area, 280 Ukrainian troops killed or wounded, though only one tank destroyed this time. Once more, the Russians say nothing about the fighting in Avdeyevka, where it's a reasonable guess that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, and where there are reports that several Bradley infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed. Now, I mention all of this because, again, so much, well, first of all, this is interesting in itself. It gives us an idea of how tightly the Russian Defense Ministry is controlling information flow from Avdeyevka, which I think explains why we are not always fully informed about all that is happening there. So that's the first thing. But it does again put in some context that incident about that solitary Russian tank that was knocked out in the area of Stepovoye near Avdeyevka. Yesterday, Ukraine lost 18 tanks in one day. 10 of them in the Bakhmut area, where all the reports suggest that the Russians continue to make significant advances. Now, because the news in Avdeyevka has sucked the oxygen, if you like, out of the news elsewhere, we are not getting so much news from other parts of the battlefronts. However, I would say that our old friend Vladimir Saldo has been commenting about the situation in Krinky. And he says that the Ukrainian army faced colossal losses in the Kherson direction. Over the past 24 hours, the situation became especially catastrophic for the Ukrainian armed forces soldiers in Krinky and along the entire combat line in Kherson region. The Ukrainians tried to take advantage of the fact that there has been a thaw in the Dnieper, and they attempted to send reinforcements to Krinky. However, this did not lead to the desired result because the fighters came under increasing fire. According to Saldo, 80 soldiers were lost. Ukraine lost 80 soldiers, which is consistent, by the way, with what the Russian Defense Ministry says, that Ukraine lost 100 soldiers yesterday, and several artillery pieces and armored personnel carriers and mortars were also lost. And he also says, Saldo also says, that Ukraine lost a radar station, 2 enemy warehouses, 5 temporary deployment points, and 6 observation posts, all presumably on the west bank of the Dnieper. Now, again, Saldo is providing us with this information, which, as I said, correlates fairly closely with what the Russian Defense Ministry are saying. I was seeing reports appearing in various places yesterday that there has been no news from Krinky. Well, clearly, there haven't been the same sort of reports coming out of Krinky. But we now learn from Saldo that, in fact, there was intense activity in Krinky, and according to him, the situation for the Ukrainians in Krinky and on the west bank of the Dnieper has now become especially catastrophic. So, just saying. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, the situation on the battlefronts today. There's been no news so far about Zaluzhny being sacked and Budanov taking over. Zelensky has hosted Donald Tusk, the new Prime Minister of Poland, who did not, I noticed, come up with any new offers of military equipment, but said that he would be providing Ukraine with $3.5 billion of funding to help them buy weapons. He also apparently agreed some kind of security pact with Ukraine. Rishi Sunak, who came along and gave Ukraine £2.5 billion of aid, He also apparently signed, he did sign a security pact with Ukraine. As many people are pointing out, these are paper documents. They have no relevance given the ongoing military situation. And what the Ukrainians need are not pieces of paper. They need more in the way of actual military hardware and aid. And Brian Beletic, in his latest program, he's now resumed doing programs after a brief break. He's been apparently unwell. Anyway, Brian Beletic has actually made the absolutely obvious point that all of these debates about providing Ukraine with extra funding and all of that sort of thing, they are entirely beside the point. The problem is not that Ukraine is short of funding for weapons, or at least not that the West is short of funding for weapons. It is short of equipment, the type of weapons that Ukraine needs in order to continue the war. It needs artillery shells, and these are now in short supply, and even Zelensky is admitting that there isn't enough artillery production in the entire West to fulfill Ukraine's needs, and they're short of air defense interceptors, and they're probably starting to become increasingly short of tanks. In terms of artillery, there's been a report somewhere, I forget which American media outlet, that the situation with artillery is now becoming so bad that one Ukrainian M109 self-propelled howitzer is now reduced to firing smoke shells that they don't have explosive, it's just smoke canisters. And that the shell shortage is intensifying, and that the Russians are now able to bring down 10 shells for every shell that Ukraine is able to fire back at them. So this is the problem. And as Brian Beletic also absolutely correctly says, there's been a lot of talk in the media in the West, amongst Western political leaders, amongst NATO officials, about the urgent need to crank up industrial production, military production, in order to fulfill Ukraine's needs. The people who are saying this do not understand industry and manufacturing and production systems. They don't understand supply chains. They don't understand the needs for skilled workers. They don't understand the needs for factory space, for machine tools. They appear to believe that simply throwing money at a problem is going to solve it, when all it will do is increase unit cost. Building up production to the kind of levels that people in the West are talking about is possible, but it requires careful, structured, coherent planning over, and not just planning, but also implementation by a team of people, mostly engineers, over a period not just of months, but likely, in this case, of years. The West got together and did something like that. Perhaps in a year or two, they would be able to increase production of shells. But for the moment, that is not what is being done. And if we're talking about shifting Western industry to a full war footing, well, straightforwardly, that is politically impossible. On the subject of supply chains, I'm just going to throw in something I generally dislike doing, a personal fact. My family needs to buy a new car. We have had an increase in the size of my family with the birth of our third daughter last year, so we need a new and bigger car, and also a car where we can also place our dogs. And the car that we had in mind, its production is being continuously delayed because of supply issues, problems with supply chains, which, far from being solved, are intensifying. And you can actually see that right across the entire manufacturing and industrial system in the West. There's been a lot of talk about how Germany is deindustrializing and how the United States, for example, is undergoing an industrial revival. Well, perhaps there is more apparent investment in American industry, but the reality is that industrial production in the United States, manufacturing production, for roughly the whole of the last year has been falling and is continuing to fall. In Russia, it is the opposite, and that is the reason why the Russians are winning the logistical and supply battle. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my program today about Ukraine. Let us now turn to the situation in the Middle East, because there is now, I think, growing acknowledgement that the United States is indeed heading towards an all-out war, a war with Iran. And we have some really extraordinary admissions about this starting to appear in parts of the West's media, and they are really remarkable and actually, in their own way, rather alarming. We, for example, read things like this. This is a US and militia, as US and militias engage, White House worries about a tipping point. This is from the New York Times, and it tells us that the number of attacks on American troops in the Middle East increases the risks of deaths, a red line that would lead to a wider war. Another day, another barrage of rockets, and another spark that American officials fear could set off a wildfire of violence across the Middle East. The latest attack on American troops in the region, this is clearly a reference to the attack on the Al-Assad base, over the weekend resulted in no deaths, but President Biden and his advisors worry that it is only a matter of time. Whenever a report of a strike arrives at the White House Situation Room, officials wonder whether this will be the one that forces a more decisive retaliation and results in a broader regional war. And then as to who the war is going to be, well, it's not difficult. The article goes on to say, as of Thursday, Iranian-backed militias had already carried out 140 attacks on American troops in Iraq and Syria, with nearly 70 US personnel wounded, some of them suffering traumatic brain injuries. All but a few have been able to return to duty in short order. American forces have at times mounted retaliations, but in limited fashion, to avoid instigating a full-fledged conflict. Biden administration officials have regularly debated the proper strategy. They do not want to let such attacks go without a response, but on the other hand do not want to go so far that the conflict would escalate into a full-fledged war, particularly by striking Iran directly. They privately say they may have no choice if American troops are killed. That is a red line that has not been crossed, but if Iranian-backed militias ever have a day of better rain or better luck? It easily could be. And there you have it, a strike on Iran. If American soldiers are killed, there will be apparently a wider war and a strike on Iran. And then we have quotes, and this is from Aaron David Miller, we're told a long-time Middle East peace negotiator who's at the Carnegie Endowment. The administration confronts a problem without a risk-free solution. They don't want to strike Iran directly for fear of escalation, which only widens the margin for pro-Iranian groups, including the Houthis, to strike at US forces. At some point, if US forces are killed, they will have no alternative but to respond directly against Iranian assets. So, we are actually heading towards a conflict with Iran because the situation on the ground actually points us that way. First of all, the fighting in Gaza continues. The Israelis today claiming that they've surrounded the district of Gaza known as Khan Yunis. Apparently 24 Israeli soldiers were killed doing so, 21 of them into explosions, which the Israelis say happened when explosives that the Israelis themselves planted to demolish buildings went off prematurely. At least that's my understanding of what the Israelis say. That, by the way, is the biggest death toll Israel has admitted to ever since the ground operation in Gaza began. But anyway, clearly the fighting in Gaza has not ended. It continues. Hamas still has its fighters in Gaza. They've undoubtedly suffered some losses. No doubt they will suffer more losses. But it looks like the Battle of Gaza is far from over and far from won, and perhaps it never will be. And I've also seen reports that the Israelis are now having to move closer towards the most densely populated parts of Gaza, so the civilian death toll might increase. And by the way, all of this corresponds very closely with what Alistair Crook said to us on a program where we interviewed him, Glenn Deason and myself. He, of course, is familiar with Gaza. He's actually been there. He knows the place well. And he pointed out that up to the point of that interview, most of the fighting from Gaza, most of the places which the Israelis had entered, were places which were less densely built up and populated. The Israelis up to that time had avoided entering the more dense areas. And for that reason, he felt that the real battle of Gaza, and this was a program we did with him about 3 weeks ago, the real battle for Gaza up to that point had not even started yet. So we are likely to see a lot more heavy fighting in Gaza before long. Of course, it is the fighting in Gaza that is driving these attacks on the American bases in Syria and Iraq. And with the Houthis, there's more now missile strikes, more attacks by the United States on the Houthi positions. These seem to be taking place every day now, every day and every night. I was reading about attacks on the Houthis in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. It looks like a long war against the Houthis is going to take place, even though it's widely acknowledged that nobody really knows how well the battle against the Houthis is actually going. There's been suggestions that it's actually going well. Others say that, in fact, they don't really know. And we have, again, another report um, telling us that the United States simply doesn't have the necessary information about the quantity of Houthi resources. We learn, this is again from the New York Times, that the US expands attacks on Houthis with new strikes in Yemen. But a senior official, this is again from the New York Times, said on Monday that the figure of underground strikes and storage sites and missile locations that the US has attacked might have crept up to 30 or 40% after at least 25 to 30 precision-guided munitions successfully hit their targets on Monday. But other US intelligence officials who have been briefed on the size and scope of the Houthis' arsenal say analysts are not sure how much weaponry the group started with. Among other Western intelligence agencies, American and other Western intelligence agencies have not spent significant time or resources in recent years collecting data on the location of Houthi air defenses, command hubs, munition depots, and storage and production facilities for drones and missiles, the official said. By the way, the last is astonishing, given that the Houthis have been fighting Saudi Arabia for years, and the United States has been involved in supporting the Saudis in that war. And given the fact that the Houthis are allies of Iran, the fact that there doesn't seem to be a proper American and Western intelligence assessment of the Houthis seems remarkable. But anyway, nobody knows how long that battle with the Houthis will last. The Houthis are still attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Commercial shipping in the Red Sea has essentially stopped, apart from Russian and Chinese shipping, which the Houthis allow to go through. So, again, we see intensifying crisis in the Middle East. Is it not inevitable that sooner or later some American soldiers will be killed? We hear that some have already been injured, some have suffered traumatic brain injuries. The fact that none have been killed is surely because the Iranians have exercised the restraint that I was talking about before, signaling to the United States through their own missile strikes their ability to defend themselves, but they have clearly not sought to kill Americans, and it looks as if the militias that are operating in Iraq and Syria are doing the same. But with the deteriorating situation in Gaza, with the military crisis now in Yemen, it has to be only a matter of time, if things go on like this, before Americans are killed in this fighting. And the New York Times is telling us that the Biden administration has decided that that is a red line, and that if Americans are killed, that will result in a strike against what they say are Iranian assets. And it's difficult to see how once that starts, we can avoid missile strikes, American missile strikes on Iran and a wider war in the Middle East. We're told that US officials are desperate to avoid this, but they seem completely oblivious to the fact that their failure to engage in any kind of coherent diplomatic activity is itself setting up the situation for the outcome, a strike on Iran, which they claim they want to avoid. Now, let's take these various articles from the United States, from the New York Times, and look at them in the round. They give the impression that, the United States has lost the initiative. There's nothing it can do. It can't control the situation in Gaza. It can only go hammer on against the Houthis, but it doesn't really know how long it will take to defeat the Houthis, or whether that's even possible. And in the meantime, there's all these strikes on these American bases, and there's nothing very much that the United States can do about that. They can launch sporadic retaliatory strikes, but that isn't deterring anybody, so the strikes are intensifying. So supposedly it's the Iranians who have the initiative and who are driving this whole process. But a brief pause shows that this is not true. There is a solution to this. There is a way of avoiding a wider war in the Middle East. And that is by supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the epicenter of the conflict. If there is a ceasefire in Gaza, then the Houthis have no more reason to launch strikes against shipping in the Red Sea. And it is likely that the fighting, the attacks on the American bases will abate, and probably at that point the Iranians will do everything they can to try to persuade the militias in Iraq and Syria to stop attacking those bases. The solution, therefore, to this whole problem is getting that ceasefire in Gaza. But the Biden administration seems incapable of doing this. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government are implacably opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza. The fact that there is now an Arab peace plan, a Saudi-led Arab peace plan being put together, which looks forward to supposedly irreversible steps towards establishing a Palestinian state, including recognition of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. Well, that appears to be driving the Israeli government into intensifying its operations in Gaza, which is why, despite the losses, we now see this encirclement of Khan Yunis and strong statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu that he's not going to agree to a ceasefire, that he's not going to agree to a Palestinian state being set up, that the Israelis must have complete security control of the entire area of the former British Mandate of Palestine. The only way that this can be brought to a stop, or so it seems to me, is if the United States now supports a ceasefire resolution, a mandatory resolution under Chapter 7 in the UN Security Council. Of course, Israel will oppose it. Of course, the Israeli government will strenuously argue against it. But that's the only way it can happen. If there is a Security Council resolution in that form, a mandatory resolution under Chapter 7, which the administration, the Biden administration, should make clear it will enforce and stand behind, then given the legal position, given the opinion across the entire world, Israel will, in my opinion, be left with no option but to comply. They cannot continue an operation like this if there is a unanimous vote in the Security Council backing a ceasefire resolution under Chapter 7. Now, then that opens up ways for further diplomatic activity to de-escalate the situation in the Middle East. Now, of course, if that happens, it is likely that President Biden's own position will be severely undermined in the United States. No doubt supporters of Israel within the Democratic Party and of course will criticize him. No doubt the Republicans, who are unequivocal in their support for Israel, will make hay of that. So the logical, the obvious thing in this situation is for the president himself to accept that his prospects of re-election are gone and to stand down and to make way for someone else. He can then spend the rest of his time as president trying to bring the situation in the Middle East back to a situation of calm and to lay down the framework for a lasting peace in the Middle East, which would, by the way, be a good way of securing his legacy. He's not going to do that. He doesn't want to back a ceasefire resolution. He doesn't want to put the necessary pressure on the Israelis because he is still intent on getting re-elected in November. And the result is that the United States is drifting into a war in the Middle East, a general war in the Middle East. The neocons obviously are pressing for it, and the events on the ground are also pulling the United States towards it because the president himself no longer has control. I cannot again begin to say how utterly demoralizing I find all of this. We're drifting into a war in the Middle East for the worst possible reasons, a war which the New York Times tells us even Biden administration officials sense would be a disaster. By the way, and in parentheses, if there is a general war in the Middle East, well, you can kiss goodbye to Ukraine, because the United States will then need all the Patriot missile interceptors that it has and all the 155mm shells that it has to deal with the problems in the Middle East, and there will then definitely be nothing left over for Ukraine. But anyway, that's for another day to discuss. But we're heading into this crisis because the administration is paralyzed. It knows what it should do, but it can't resolve its own internal problems. Probably the president, anyway, viscerally, doesn't want to see a ceasefire in Gaza. He consistently takes the most belligerent line that he can on all of these problems. But he is still focused on his re-election, and that apparently is what now is driving everything. Well, there we go. We'll see how it all shapes out. There will be further ceasefire resolutions appearing, draft resolutions being presented to the Security Council before very long. We are also undoubtedly going to have this peace plan appear at some point over the next few weeks. We'll see whether that causes anything to change. But this is where I finish this long video today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can buy all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, and by the way, there's a 15% discount on shirts. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.